Wild Sunset promised by Clara Winslow. The distant mountains glowed crimson as twilight descended upon the small town of Copper Ridge. Margaret Wellington stood on the wooden platform of the train station, her gloved hands clutching her valise as she surveyed what was to be her new home. The frontier town was nothing like San Francisco with its grand buildings and cobblestone streets, but there was something about the rugged simplicity that called to her spirit. "Miss Wellington?" A deep voice broke through her thoughts. Margaret turned to face a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face. His eyes, the color of the summer sky, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The silver badge pinned to his vest caught the last rays of sunlight. "Sheriff Thomas Reeves," he introduced himself with a slight bow of his head. "I've been asked to escort you to your uncle's ranch." "How kind of you, Sheriff," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She had not expected her uncle to send the town's lawmen to retrieve her. "Your uncle would have come himself, but there was trouble with some cattle rustlers north of here." The sheriff took her valise and offered his arm. "The wagon is this way." As they walked, Margaret felt the curious gazes of the townspeople following her. She had known it would be this way. Newcomers in small frontier towns were always objects of fascination, especially a woman traveling alone. "Is it far to my uncle's property?" she asked, climbing into the wagon with the sheriff's assistance. "About an hour's ride," he replied, settling beside her. "The Double W is one of the largest ranches in these parts." Margaret nodded, smoothing her skirts. Her uncle, William Wellington, had written to her after her parents' passing, offering her a home. Having no other family and few prospects in San Francisco, she had accepted his invitation, though they had never met. Her father had rarely spoken of his brother, who had left the East Coast decades ago, to seek his fortune in the untamed West. "You've come a long way," the sheriff observed, guiding the horses away from the station. "Indeed I have." She gazed at the landscape unfolding before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, the distant mountains standing like sentinels against the darkening sky. "Though I suspect the greatest journey still lies ahead." Sheriff Reeves cast her a sidelong glance, his lips curving into a smile. "You don't seem like most Eastern ladies who find themselves in these parts." "I'm from California, Sheriff, not the East," she corrected him. "And I've never claimed to be like most ladies." His smile widened. "I stand corrected, Miss Wellington." The wagon jostled over the uneven trail, and Margaret found herself studying the man beside her. There was something compelling about Sheriff Reeves, a quiet strength in the way he held himself, an assurance in his movements that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "How long have you been sheriff?" she asked. 5 years now." His gaze remained fixed on the trail ahead. "Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a spell." "And what brought you to Copper Ridge?" A shadow crossed his face. "I was tracking a man. By the time I found him, he'd already been killed in a saloon fight. The town needed a sheriff, and I needed a place to stop running." The honesty of his answer surprised her. Most men would have offered some polished tale of heroism or duty. "And you, Miss Wellington, what circumstances led a young lady from San Francisco to the Wyoming Territory?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "My father was a merchant. When he and my mother died of influenza last winter, I discovered his business was deeply in debt. Everything was sold to pay his creditors." "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Thank you." She took a deep breath, forcing back the grief that still threatened to overwhelm her at times. "My uncle's letter arrived at a providential moment. I had few options remaining." "William Wellington is a good man," Sheriff Reeves offered. "Stubborn as the day is long, but honest and fair." "That's reassuring to hear. We've never met." The sheriff looked surprised. "Never. My father and uncle had some disagreement long ago. The nature of it was never explained to me." Margaret glanced at the rolling landscape around them. "I only hope my uncle doesn't find me a disappointment." "I doubt that's possible, Miss Wellington." Something in his tone made her turn to face him, but his expression revealed nothing as he guided the horses around a bend in the trail. As darkness settled, the sheriff pointed to a distant cluster of lights. "The Double W." The ranch was larger than Margaret had expected, a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and a large barn. Lanterns burned in the windows and figures moved about the yard even at this late hour. As they approached, a man stepped onto the porch. Tall and imposing, with a shock of white hair and a neatly trimmed beard, he watched their arrival with his hands on his hips. "That's your uncle," Sheriff Reeves said, drawing the wagon to a halt. William Wellington approached as the sheriff helped Margaret down from the wagon. "So you're George's girl," he said without preamble, his gaze assessing her from head to toe. "Yes, sir, Margaret Wellington." She met his gaze unflinchingly, though her stomach knotted with apprehension. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his stern expression softened. "You have your mother's eyes. And your father's stubborn chin." He reached out and, to her surprise, took her hand in his. "Welcome to the Double W, niece. It's been too long without a Wellington woman around these parts." Relief washed over her. "Thank you for taking me in, Uncle." "Family is family," he said gruffly. "Even when they're fools who don't know when to swallow their pride." He turned to the sheriff. "Thanks for bringing her, Tom. You'll stay for supper?" Sheriff Reeves hesitated, glancing at Margaret. "I should head back to town." "Nonsense," William insisted. "It's a long ride in the dark. You'll eat and rest here tonight." Before the sheriff could protest further, a commotion arose from one of the outbuildings. A young ranch hand burst into the yard. "Mr. Wellington. Riders approaching from the north pasture. Looks like Mason and his men." William's expression darkened. "Get inside, Margaret. Tom, I could use your help." Sheriff Reeves was already moving, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "How many?" "4, maybe 5, the ranch hand reported. Margaret found herself ushered into the house by a gray-haired woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Cooper, the housekeeper. Through the window, she watched as the men of the ranch armed themselves. "What's happening?" she asked. Mrs. Cooper's lips thinned. "Victor Mason has been trying to force your uncle to sell part of his water rights for months. Last week, some of our cattle were found dead near the creek." Moments later, 5 riders entered the yard. Even in the dim light of the lanterns, Margaret could see the tension in the set of their shoulders, the deliberate way they arranged themselves facing the ranch house. The man in the center, presumptively Victor Mason, dismounted. He was expensively dressed, with the smug confidence of someone used to getting his way. William and Sheriff Reeves stood side by side, blocking his path to the house. Though she couldn't hear their exchange, the hostility was evident in their postures. When Mason gestured angrily toward the house, Margaret instinctively stepped back from the window. "He knows you've arrived," Mrs. Cooper said quietly. "A new heir to the Wellington fortune changes his calculations." "Fortune?" Margaret echoed, surprised. "My uncle is wealthy?" "One of the richest men in the territory," Mrs. Cooper confirmed. "The Double W sits atop not just good grazing land but also a copper deposit that Mr. Wellington's been developing quietly for years." Outside, the confrontation appeared to be escalating. Sheriff Reeves had stepped between William and Mason, one hand raised in a placating gesture while the other remained near his gun. "Shouldn't we do something?" Margaret asked, watching anxiously. "The men will handle it," Mrs. Cooper replied, though concern creased her brow. Unable to stand by idly, Margaret moved toward the door. "Miss Wellington," Mrs. Cooper hissed, "your uncle said to stay inside." "I won't cower in a corner while my family faces danger," Margaret replied firmly, stepping onto the porch. All eyes turned to her as she emerged. The sudden silence was heavy with tension. "Uncle," she called, moving to stand beside him. "Won't you introduce me to your guests?" William cast her a surprised glance, but she saw a flicker of admiration in his eyes before he turned back to the riders. "This is my niece, Miss Margaret Wellington," he announced. "Margaret, these men were just leaving." Victor Mason removed his hat, revealing slick-back dark hair streaked with gray. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he offered a shallow bow. "Miss Wellington, what a pleasure. I had heard rumors of your arrival." His gaze swept over her appraisingly. "You must find our little corner of Wyoming quite primitive after San Francisco society." "On the contrary, Mr. Mason," she replied coolly. "I find the landscape breathtaking and the company illuminating." Mason's smile faltered at her tone. Sheriff Reeves had moved slightly, positioning himself between her and Mason with a subtlety that might have gone unnoticed by others, but Margaret saw it clearly. "We'll continue this discussion another time, Wellington," Mason said, replacing his hat, "when there are fewer distractions." "There's nothing to discuss," William replied firmly. "My answer remains no." Mason's expression hardened. "Every man has his breaking point. Even you." His gaze lingered on Margaret, the implied threat unmistakable. "Good evening, Miss Wellington. I suspect we'll be seeing much more of each other." As Mason and his men rode away, Margaret felt Sheriff Reeves's gaze on her. When she met his eyes, she found both concern and something warmer that made her pulse quicken. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said quietly. "Sometimes they're one and the same," she replied. William clasped her shoulder. "You've got spirit, girl. You'll need it around here." He glanced between her and the sheriff with a knowing look. "Now, let's have that supper before anything else tries to kill my appetite." Over the following weeks, Margaret settled into life at the Double W. She discovered that beneath her uncle's gruff exterior lay a kind heart. The story of his estrangement from her father emerged gradually. A disagreement over a woman they had both loved, Margaret's mother, who had chosen George Wellington over his older brother. He got the better end of that bargain, William told her one evening as they sat on the porch. "Your mother was the finest woman I ever knew. I couldn't bring myself to forgive him for years, but time has a way of mellowing even the hardest feelings." "Why didn't you marry?" Margaret asked. William chuckled. "Never found another woman who measured up, and then I got too set in my ways." He studied her face in the fading light. "You remind me of her sometimes? Same determination?" Sheriff Reeves became a frequent visitor to the ranch, initially under the pretense of keeping an eye on Mason and his men, but soon it became clear that his interest lay elsewhere. Margaret found herself looking forward to his visits, to their conversations that ranged from books to politics to his adventures with the Rangers. One afternoon he arrived as Margaret was returning from a ride around the property. She had taken to exploring the vast ranch, much to Mrs. Cooper's dismay at her unladylike enthusiasm for solitary excursions. "Miss Wellington," he greeted her, dismounting to walk beside her as she led her horse toward the stables. "Out surveying your kingdom?" She laughed. "Hardly that. Though I must admit, I've grown quite attached to this land in a short time." "It has that effect," he agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon before returning to her face, "as do some of its inhabitants." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at his direct gaze. "Sheriff Reeves." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "Or Tom, if you prefer." "Thomas," she conceded with a small smile. "Have you come with news about Mason?" His expression grew serious. "Yes, though I wish it were better. He's filed a claim challenging your uncle's water rights. It's baseless, but it will require a trip to Cheyenne for a hearing." "When must you go?" "I leave tomorrow. Your uncle follows in a few days with his documentation." "I see." They had reached the stables, and a ranch hand took Margaret's horse. As they walked toward the house, Thomas stopped, turning to face her. "Margaret," he began, using her given name for the first time, "I had hoped to speak with you privately before I left." Her pulse quickened. "What about?" "About my intentions." He removed his hat, holding it before him. "I realize we've known each other only a short while, but I find myself thinking of you more than is probably wise." Margaret smiled, emboldened by his candor. "Is there wisdom in matters of the heart, Sheriff?" "Not much, in my experience," he admitted with a rueful smile, "which is why I wanted to ask your permission to call on you properly when I return from Cheyenne. With your uncle's blessing, of course." "And if I gave my permission?" she asked softly. "Then I'd be the most fortunate man in the Wyoming Territory." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet sure. "And I'd promise to do everything in my power to be worthy of your regard." Before she could respond, a shot rang out from the direction of the north pasture. Thomas was immediately alert, his hand moving to his gun. "Get to the house," he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice. Margaret hesitated only briefly before racing toward the main house. She found her uncle already on the porch, rifle in hand. "Mason's men," he growled. "Testing our defenses, most likely." More shots followed, and the ranch hands scrambled for cover and weapons. Thomas appeared beside them, his expression grim. "They're at the north fence line," he reported. "At least 6 of them." William nodded grimly. "Been expecting this since you told me about that water rights claim. Mason knows he'll lose in court. He's trying to force my hand." "I need to get back to town," Thomas said. "Get the deputy and some men." "You'll be riding right into their line of fire," William objected. Margaret felt cold fear grip her at the thought of Thomas riding out alone against Mason's men. There must be another way. "The creek trail," William suggested after a moment. "It's longer but less exposed. Margaret knows it, she rides it almost daily." Thomas shook his head. "I can't ask her to." "I'll show you," Margaret interrupted firmly. "We can take the trail behind the stables. It's sheltered by trees most of the way. Before either man could protest, she was moving toward the back of the house. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas followed. "This is too dangerous," he said as they slipped into the stables through the back entrance. "Not if we're careful," she replied, leading him to where the horses were kept. "And you need to reach town. How many men would Mason have watching the main road?" Thomas conceded with a reluctant nod. "At least 2. They saddled their horses quickly and quietly. As Margaret mounted, Thomas caught her arm. "If there's trouble, you ride hard for the ranch. Don't wait for me." She met his gaze steadily. "The same applies to you, Sheriff." They rode out through a small gate at the rear of the stables, immediately entering a copse of trees that provided cover. Margaret led them along a narrow trail that followed the creek, weaving through the trees and underbrush. "You ride well?" Thomas observed quietly as they picked their way along the rough path. "My father insisted I learn," she replied. "He claimed it was for propriety's sake, but I think he simply enjoyed our morning rides together." They rode in silence for a time, alert for any sign of Mason's men. The creek gurgled beside them, and the trees cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. "What will happen when this is over?" Margaret asked finally, the question that had been weighing on her mind. Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening. "That depends on many things." "On what?" "On whether we can prove Mason's behind these attacks. On whether your uncle decides to stay and fight or sell up and move on." He hesitated. "On what you want, Margaret." "What if I don't know what I want?" she asked softly. "Then we figure it out together," he replied. "If that's what you wish." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Thomas signaled for silence, guiding his mount deeper into the trees. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. 2 riders appeared on the trail ahead, moving slowly, their rifles ready. Margaret recognized one as Victor Mason himself. Thomas drew his pistol silently. "Stay here," he whispered. "If anything happens, ride back to the ranch." Without waiting for her response, he urged his horse forward, emerging onto the trail with his gun leveled at the 2 men. "That's far enough, Mason," his voice rang out, startling the riders. Mason recovered quickly, his face twisting into a sneer. "Sheriff Reeves. Out for a romantic ride with the Wellington girl." "I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and suspected cattle rustling," Thomas replied, ignoring the taunt. Mason laughed. "On what evidence?" "We have witnesses who saw your men near the dead cattle last week. And now you're on Wellington property again, armed and looking for trouble." "We're simply out for a ride ourselves," Mason replied smoothly, "on what's soon to be my property." "You seem very confident for a man facing serious charges," Thomas observed. Mason's companion shifted nervously, his hand inching toward his holstered gun. Thomas noticed the movement. "Don't try it," he warned. "You won't be fast enough." From her hiding place, Margaret watched the standoff with mounting dread. The tension was palpable, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Any moment it could erupt into violence. Making a swift decision, she urged her horse forward, emerging from the trees to join Thomas. All 3 men looked at her in surprise. "Mr. Mason," she greeted him calmly, as though they had met on a town street rather than in an armed confrontation. "How fortunate to encounter you. I've been meaning to discuss your proposal with my uncle." Mason's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What proposal would that be, Miss Wellington?" "To purchase the north section of the ranch, of course." She smiled serenely. "My uncle mentioned you were interested, though he failed to specify the terms." Thomas shot her a warning glance, but she continued, addressing Mason's companion. "And you must be Mr. Mason's lawyer, here to draft the agreement." The man blinked in confusion. "I? No, miss." "What game are you playing, girl?" Mason demanded. "No game, sir. Merely business." Her gaze hardened. "Unlike your games with cattle rustling and intimidation." Mason's face flushed with anger. "You have no proof." "But we do," Thomas interrupted. "One of your men was caught by Wellington's ranch hands during the shooting. He's likely singing like a bird back at the ranch house right now." It was a bluff, but Margaret saw doubt flicker in Mason's eyes. His companion looked increasingly nervous. "We should go back, boss," he muttered. "This ain't worth it." For a tense moment, Mason hesitated. Then he holstered his gun with deliberate slowness. "This isn't over, Reeves. Not by a long shot." "It is for today," Thomas replied evenly. Now turn around and ride back the way you came. And if I see you near Wellington property again without a written invitation, I'll have you in a cell so fast your head will spin." With a final glare, Mason and his companion turned their horses and rode away. Thomas waited until they were out of sight before lowering his gun. "That was reckless," he said to Margaret, though his tone held more admiration than censure. "It worked, didn't it?" she countered. "And I couldn't very well let you face them alone." He shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "You're unlike any woman I've ever known, Margaret Wellington." "I hope that's a compliment, Sheriff." "The highest," he assured her, his gaze softening. "Though you nearly stopped my heart when you rode out like that." They continued toward town, the trail widening enough to allow them to ride side by side. The encounter with Mason had shifted something between them, a newfound understanding born of shared danger. "When this is over," Margaret said as the first buildings of Copper Ridge came into view, "what will you do?" Thomas considered her question. "That depends on whether I have reason to stay." "And what reason might that be?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her fully. "You know very well, Margaret Wellington." She smiled, her heart full. "Then I believe you'll be staying in Copper Ridge for quite some time, Sheriff Reeves." "I certainly hope so," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers as they rode together into town, toward whatever future awaited them in this wild, beautiful land.